So, our theme is intentional faith development, or to put it another way, discipleship, or growing in faith. Those verses from 1 Peter chapter 2 remind us this is actually part of our identity as God's people. We're meant to be hungry. The passage says we're to be like newborn babies, always thirsty, always hungry. It's a while since my children were that age, but I remember what that time was like when they were little babies, constantly hungry. Got a couple of friends who've had babies recently, and they've asked me, is it always going to be like this? Waking up every 2 hours, screaming their heads off, desperate to be fed, and 2 hours later, hungry again. That's the image that Peter gives us of what we are supposed to be like as Christians. Constantly hungry, constantly wanting the kind of food that will help us grow in faith. And then we're given another image in that letter from Peter. Living stones being built up into a spiritual house. We might think of stones as being static, but the image that we get here is living stones, stones with a purpose, stones that are not just lying around on the ground doing nothing, but stones which have a purpose, and the purpose is to be built into something else, something greater. In both of those images, what we get is the idea of transformation, of growth and development. These are part of our identity as Christians and part of the purpose that God has for us. We are his chosen people. We heard that again in that reading from 1 Peter. We are chosen in order that we might point people to God. The author of that letter says it rather more poetically, but that's the point. The point is we're supposed to point people to God. So we are, as Christians, a people of purpose, a people of intention and intentionality. Intentional faith development is about developing our faith on purpose, rather than hoping that it'll happen by accident or assuming that it will happen automatically as we get older. I always think it's quite interesting. Jesus, when he refers to his followers, doesn't talk about converts, and he doesn't talk about supporters. He refers to them as disciples, which means learners. He called his followers to be learners. And at the end of Matthew's Gospel, that passage that we think of as the Great Commission, Jesus doesn't say, go and see how many converts you can make. He doesn't say, go and see how much support you can drum up. He says, go and make more learners. I wonder if one of the problems that we have in the church is that we become so focused on making converts rather than making learners. We invest a lot, don't we, in Sunday school and in things like alpha courses or membership courses that bring people to that point of belief. And then we kind of leave them to it. We make them members, and we hope then that they'll sort of work the other things out by themselves as they go along. Jesus called us to be learners and then to make more learners, so our churches ought to be places that are full of learners. But I don't know whether they are. And I wonder whether, rather than having churches full of learners, we ended up with churches that are full of two different types of people. I wonder whether we end up with people who think they know none of the answers and people who think they know all of the answers. And actually, both of those situations stop us from being disciples and stop us from being people that point others to God. People who think they know none of the answers, I encounter quite regularly in churches, and they become afraid to point other people to God. They become actually sometimes afraid even to talk to other people about God. And maybe you've been in that situation yourself where you've just felt like you didn't know any of the answers and therefore you didn't want to get into conversation with somebody else about God in case you get caught out with a question that you don't know the answer to. What happens then is we make a choice to stop learning and we delegate the task of pointing other people to God to the professionals, the lay workers, the ministers, the evangelists. That's actually a much less effective system than the one that Jesus had in mind. My sphere of influence as a minister is relatively small, and most of the people within it are people who are already Christians and already come to church regularly. The people that I meet week to week and the people that I speak to are, by and large, already Christians. The people that all of you meet day to day in your everyday life, most of them I will never meet. And that means that if the task of pointing them to God is left to me, they're going to miss out. So then the church becomes no longer a place of learning and no longer a place that is fulfilling the purpose of God. At the other extreme, we have people who know all the answers. And I guess we've probably all met people in church like that. Maybe you are one of those people, I don't know. But we've probably all met people, haven't we, in churches who have also stopped learning, but this time they've stopped learning because they think they've got it all sorted. They're really convinced about everything to do with faith. They're pretty sure they know all the answers. They've been around long enough, they've heard it all before, they've heard countless sermons. They feel like they have gone as far as they need to go. And because they're so sure that they've got all the answers, one of the things they do is that they don't make space for the questions. So when other people come along who see things differently, or who have doubts and questions, or who find that the answers that they're getting just don't seem to add up, and those people find there isn't space for them in that church. And they either go elsewhere, or worse, they walk away from the faith altogether. So then that church too ceases to be a place of learning and is also no longer fulfilling the purpose God intended for it. If we're going to be what Jesus calls us to be, learners, learners who create a place for other people to learn, we have to develop a culture that's about learning and that's about intentional development of our faith. We have to be places that take people beyond the faith that they get in junior church. As good as junior churches across the country might be, too many Christians never move on from that Sunday school faith. They know the basic stories, they have a simple picture of God, and they have the basis for a life of faith. The trouble is that Sunday school faith is a little bit like the first house in the story of the three little pigs. You know, the one that's made of straw? It doesn't stand up to much. People find that as they get older, they begin to think more deeply about life and faith, or they begin to experience some of the challenges of life. They find that simplistic faith they had as a child doesn't answer some of the questions they're now beginning to wrestle with. And so people either walk away from faith, or they end up living a kind of double life, where they have one set of beliefs through the week that explains the world that they live in, and then on Sunday they put all of that to one side, all of their doubts and questions to one side, and they pick up that Sunday school faith again for the hour that they're in the building, and then put it down again at the exit. I don't think that Jesus calls us to that kind of simplistic faith. In fact, the authors in the New Testament urge us all the time to grow up in our faith, mature in our faith. In Hebrews chapter 5, you actually read the author saying a criticism of his readers for not growing up. He says to them, "By now you should be teachers, but you're not ready yet for solid food. You still haven't got the basics right." If we're going to help people to experience a real living faith that lives in the real grown-up world, we have to help people to move on from their Sunday school faith. We have to be a kind of place in our churches that encourage a culture of learning and growing, and places that are intentional about faith development. Jesus emphasised the importance of it in that other reading that we heard tonight, in that story from Luke chapter 10 about Mary and Martha. Well-known story, we've probably heard it preached on lots of times. Martha is fussing around. She's very busy doing all kinds of things, and she's doing things for the church, because effectively that's what that little group gathered in her house are. The first Christian church, led by Jesus, moving around from place to place, no permanent base, but today based in the house of Mary and Martha. And Martha is doing work for the church. She's tidying up, she's making sure the preacher has a glass of water, she's making sure there's going to be tea and coffee or refreshments after the service. She's doing all those jobs. And Jesus says to her, Martha, those things are important, but they're not the main thing. Mary has got it right because she's focused on the main thing. And it's easy, Martha, to busy yourself with all of those other things and miss the main thing. Mary has focused on the main thing. She's chosen to come and engage with me. She's chosen, Jesus says, to develop her faith. All those other things are good, aren't they? And all of those other things are things that often we do ourselves and that we need to do in the running of the church. They make our services and our times together run more smoothly. But they can be, can't they, a distraction from the main thing. They can be a distraction from choosing to develop our faith. We can use all the activity in the church as an excuse for convincing ourselves that we're putting lots of time and effort into doing things for the church without ever actually doing the things that help us to know God and love God more. Jesus says Mary has chosen the right thing. She's chosen to develop her faith. She's chosen to do something which involves sitting at the feet of Jesus. But not just sitting and listening. That's quite important. She does sit at the feet of Jesus, but actually what she's invited into in that group, sitting around Jesus' feet, is a group who are doing more than just listening to Jesus speaking. They're engaged in a conversation with Jesus. They're involved in a discussion. They are able to ask questions and raise doubts and talk to one another about what Jesus is saying. They're in a place where they can do more than just listen to the teaching of Jesus. And I think that's quite crucial because I think there's only so much we can learn from just sitting and listening. If you think about Jesus' own ministry for a minute, quite often we hear, don't we, that people hear Jesus speak, and I guess we have to assume that Jesus is the best preacher of all time. And people listen to Jesus speak, and we're told that they're amazed at his teaching. And as we read on, we discover why they're amazed. They're amazed a lot of the time because they don't know what he's talking about. They're amazed because they don't understand his teaching. That's what's so amazing about it. He teaches with authority, and he teaches them things that they don't quite understand. Actually, a lot of the time, even the disciples don't understand. There are lots of examples in the Gospels of the disciples going to Jesus afterwards and saying to him effectively, "What was that all about? Great sermon today, Jesus. You know, one of your good ones. Loved the illustration about the sower and the seeds and all of that. But what on earth does it mean?" I think one of the things that we learn from that is that just sitting and listening isn't enough to develop our faith. Even listening to a preacher as good as Jesus didn't help some of those people move on in their faith. What helped them move on in their faith was what happened afterwards. It was when they went to Jesus and said, "Tell us what you meant." It was when they were able to be honest about their lack of understanding. It was when Jesus let them watch what he was doing and when he sent them out to try it for themselves, and when he eventually said, now go and teach other people. Those were the things that helped them develop their faith. There's an old Chinese proverb which we use quite often when I'm doing outdoor activity instructing. It says, what I hear, I forget. What I see, I remember. What I do, I understand. What I teach, I master. If the only thing that we do in our Christian life to develop our faith is sit and listen to a preacher, even a really good preacher, that really limits the amount of spiritual growth that is possible. The model that we see in the Bible, and the one that's practiced by churches that are growing, is a model that involves intentional faith development. People choosing to improve their faith and doing the things which make that possible. Some of you will know I quite enjoy canoeing, and a little while ago I was trying to learn to do an Eskimo roll, which is where you capsize and then you use your paddle and your body to bring yourself back upright again. And I'd seen people do it, I'd read about it in the canoe instruction manuals, I'd even watched some videos on YouTube of how to do it. I have to say, none of that made me able to do it. At some point, I had to get in the water in my canoe and give it a go. So it is with developing our faith. It's not enough, actually, just to hear about it. Even year after year, hearing good preachers, or to watch other people doing it. At some point, we have to get in the water. At some point, we have to do it for ourselves. Choose to develop our faith and then do the things which will help that to happen. So how do we do that? It's no good, is it, just being told, go away and develop your faith. It's no good just being told, read the Bible more or pray more. Alison Wilkinson was talking about this yesterday at ECG North East, and she said, when those things happen, when we hear a preacher say, go away and read your Bible more, it doesn't make us read our Bible more. And when you hear a preacher say, you all need to go away and pray more, it doesn't make us go home and pray more. What it does is make us feel guilty that we're not reading our Bible more and we're not praying more. It's not enough just to be told, is it, that we need to go away and do something. The model that we see in the Bible, and a model that we see in churches that grow, and a model that I think is much more successful, is one of growing together. It's one where we support one another, we challenge one another, we teach one another, and we learn from one another. So when we struggle to pray, we find that it's easier to pray together. And sometimes other people pray on our behalf. And when we struggle to read the Bible, perhaps it's easier to read the Bible together. We learn faith better in community. Proverbs puts it like this. It says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. It's the model of faith development that we see in the early church in the book of Acts, as they meet together and they share together and they reflect on the scriptures together. It's the model that we see in Paul's letter to the Ephesians. When Paul talks about what it means to live the Christian life, he sets it in the context of community and of learning in community, being in the kind of community that holds us accountable, that encourages us, that knocks off the rough edges. Paul talks about the kinds of things that we need to do in order to grow in faith, and none of them make sense outside of community. He talks about things like never letting the sun go down on an argument. Well, that makes no sense, does it, if you're on your own trying to live the life of faith, unless you're one of those people that argues with yourself. But generally, it makes no sense. All of the things that Paul talks about that help develop faith when he writes to the Ephesians are about learning in community. And it's the model that we see in early Methodism, when John Wesley wanted to grow in faith. He set up not a church, but a society with the aim of becoming more holy. And he got together a group of people and they met together in order to inspire and encourage one another to grow in faith. And one of the things they used to do, which I've probably shared before, is they used to go round the circle and tell one another right plainly, this is how it's described, their faults and failings. And now imagine that for a moment. Imagine if I asked you now to turn to one another and tell each other the faults that you see in one another. Imagine if I said, Ken, I've been watching you this week and I've noticed a couple of things I feel I just ought to point out to you. And Ian, I saw the other day when you were doing such and such a thing and really not the ideal. This is what Wesley and his colleagues did, not in order to make people feel bad, not in order to single people out and make them feel guilty, but in order that they might improve their Christian life. It's a bit like when I'm canoeing and I'm trying to learn that Eskimo roll. One of the most helpful things is having other people watch me and say, you didn't do that bit quite right. Not to make me feel bad, but so they can say, what you need to do instead is this. Here's something that might help you to be more effective and more efficient. Above all, this model of growing together is a model that we see in Jesus. Jesus gives a wonderful picture of putting on the yoke. And that probably doesn't make a lot of sense to us today because we're not really in the kind of communities where we're regularly using yokes. But yokes were a wooden bar that attached one animal to another so that they could pull a plough or other kind of farming implements. And the animals would be paired in twos, but in a particular way. An experienced one and a younger one. The younger one had strength and energy. The older one had wisdom and experience. If you put two of the young animals together, they would go too fast. They would be exhausted before the job was done. If you put two of the older ones together, it would take longer, and they tended to have a bit of a stubborn streak. Not making any comments there. Pairing them up, a younger one and an older one, was the way that they did it. When they found that that was the way that worked best. And this is the model that Jesus offers. He says, take on my yoke. And he puts himself there as our partner who is going to be yoked with us. And then we see it worked out in the lives of his disciples as he sends them out on mission, not on their own, but in twos, paired one with another. We see it in the ministry of people like Paul, where he takes other people with him to learn from him. It's a model of learning from one another, supporting one another in our different strengths and skills. For in that pairing of the oxen, it's not just one oxen that's teaching the other one. Actually, they both have something to learn and contribute to the other. If we want to grow in faith, Jesus offers us a model which is about relationship, which is about learning together in community, and it's about being intentional. So I want to leave you with some challenges to think about this week. I want to ask, what are you doing intentionally to develop your faith? I want to ask, what are we doing as churches to be the kind of place that puts an emphasis on developing our faith? And what are we offering other people that will help them develop their faith? I want to ask, who is learning from you? Who is your fellow oxen, if you like? Who is travelling beside you? Who's learning from you? And who are you learning from?